dear colleagues, dear friends, dear union delegates, honorable guests, it's our pleasure to welcome you for this student consultation on the 5 thematic tracks of the United Nations Transforming Education Summit, which will take place later on in September at the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in New York. As student unions, we understand the importance of this initiative coming at a time in which the world is in the progress of COVID recovery, in which educational disruptions continue to impact life realities of learners throughout all levels and all sectors of education. The summit promises to be a real opportunity for the revitalization of national and global efforts to achieve SDG 4 and to reimagine education to be fit to face the challenges of today and tomorrow. And it emerges at a very critical time, representing a unique window of opportunity to elevate long-standing demands from students and teacher unions to the top of the political agenda. However, as you very much know, political commitments won't be enough to solve the multidimensional crisis we face in the education sector. And an unprecedented effort of key stakeholder groups in the educational community is needed to sustain the momentum generated by the summit, to enable a grassroots movement for the transformation of education, to hold governments accountable in their endeavor to translate commitments into tangible actions. Today, at our end, marks the very first step in this direction, when you as student union delegates come together to consult on your national and regional priorities, which will then be translated into a set of recommendations towards the Transforming Education Secretariat and ultimately national decision makers. But before we get started with introducing the thematic tracks, the guiding questions, and jumping into the breakout sessions, it's our pleasure to welcome Professor Leonardo Garnier, who is the special advisor to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres on the Transforming Education Summit, to frame our discussions through his opening remarks. Mr. Garnier, it's an honor to have you join this event, and I want to once again thank you for your time, commitment, and leadership around making this summit truly participatory for key stakeholder groups, including democratic and representative student unions from secondary and tertiary institutions that have gathered here today. We appreciate it immensely, and the floor is yours, sir.
No, thank you, Sebastian. It's really a pleasure to be here. I want to thank you for the invitation to speak at this Global Student Forum with respect to the Transforming Education Summit and its different action tracks. For us, these consultations are critical for the relevance and for the success of the summit. I also want to apologize for not staying for the whole meeting, which I would have loved, but in my schedule, I had a previously organized meeting with UNESCO ambassadors an hour from now, so I will stay for an hour in this meeting with you. Okay, let's start by recognizing that during the first 2 decades of the 21st centuries, at least there was some progress in education in most countries. Budgets and enrollment rates increased, including for girls, but still we were not even close to reaching the goal of transforming education into a true human right. Millions of children and young persons were out of school or out of college, and of those attending school, many were not even learning the basics. And then the world was hit by the COVID pandemic with the devastating effects on education. This is the context in which the Secretary General of the UN convened the Transforming Education Summit, which is not a technical, but rather this is a political summit. Its goal is to galvanize social and political commitment to transform education so that we can really guarantee that quality education for all in this planet is really a right that everybody has. As we had agreed in the 4th Sustainable Development Goal of SDG or SDG 4, these things are not new. They have been there. The problem is we have not really reaching those goals. The summit, of course, does not start from scratch. It is based on the abundant knowledge, research, existing best practices, in particular on the Reimagine Our Futures report by the International Commission on the Futures of Education. And it is important to also to say that the summit is not an end in itself, but rather we aim the summit to be more like a turning point. The summit pretends to ignite a movement, especially a youth movement, for the transformation of education, is something that goes beyond business as usual, beyond doing things just a little faster or a little better, and of course, beyond merely recovering from the pandemic. We don't want to go back to where we were before the pandemic. We must aim higher. We must reimagine, transform education into a passionate and a rigorous process of individual and collective self-discovery, self-development, so that every student has the best opportunities to flourish in every sense, no matter where he or she is. So we're talking about transforming education. So I'd like to spend a few minutes trying to explain what is it that we mean by transforming education. First, and first things first, of course, education must develop each student's capacity for learning the fundamental building blocks of knowledge. Literacy is critical, numeracy is critical, and understanding the basics of scientific thinking is also critical to know that there is a cause and an effect, that not to fall easily into the trap of fake news and fake knowledge and this whole discussion that we have on these days. The basis for
acontece no mundo para não se
to understand the basics of literacy, numeracy, and scientific thinking. So that's the first. The second is our understanding that education must enhance the lifelong capacity to learn and relearn the skills for the rapidly changing world of work, not just on a technical sense, but also in the organizational aspects, to the fair, to the respectful managing of human relations. We must recognize that education starts at the earliest possible stages of life. So insist that pre-primary and early childhood education is something very important, and that it continues through life. A third essential task of education, and this is very much reflected in the UNESCO's document on reimagining our futures, is the fact that education should develop our capacity and the values for learning to live together. This sounds simple, and it's probably the most difficult thing of all, to learn to live together. This has to do with ethics, has to do with equality, with justice, with civic responsibility, understanding how democracy works, and of course, understanding and respecting human rights. It has to do with the respect and enjoyment of human diversity, which goes beyond tolerance and really means to enjoy the fact that we humans are so different, so diverse. And especially it has to do with our understanding and respect of women's rights and gender equality. And finally, of course, education has to do with our capacity and our active commitment with sustainable development. Education is a key element in our becoming active citizens in our own communities, in our countries, and on a global scale. And this is part of what we mean by transforming education. I always like to emphasize a fourth and usually underappreciated role of education, which is that of developing our capacity to enjoy life and to live life fully and well. This includes many of the most sublime aspects of the human endeavor: our creative potential, our aesthetical capacity to enjoy and to express ourselves through the arts, our disposition for leading a healthy life, our practices of physical activities, games, sports, as well as the pleasure of stimulating entertainment and our capacity for sharing this joy with others. These are aspects that are usually left out of education and should be right there in the center. In a nutshell, I would say that education or a transformed education should give every girl, every boy, every young or not so young person both the ambition to expand their dreams and the capacity to make them real, the capacity to become the person they want to be and to participate in the creation of the world they want to live in. So that's like the basic framework of what we mean by transforming education. Of course, for achieving that kind of transformation, we need other critical transformations. To start, we must transform schools. Schools have to become really inclusive places, safe, healthy, stimulating learning places. They should not exclude anybody. They should accept every girl, every boy, young person, and make them feel welcome, cared for, protected, stimulated, supported. The school, and not just the school, the educational community must become a space and time of human integration, of our coming together in this rich human diversity without discrimination of any kind, without mockery, abuse, aggression, things that we often sadly find in our schools and high schools. That's one of the transformations we need for achieving what I was mentioning before. Second has to do with teachers. Of course, teachers are a central actor in education, and teachers must also transform themselves in order to transform education. They have to move from the passive to the active, from the traditionally vertical, unidirectional role they play to a much more collaborative role, from just teaching answers or to promoting learning based on questions and curiosity, from merely transmitting content to developing the capacity, the joy, the discipline for problem solving. Teachers, in fact, should become the guides of their students' increasingly autonomous learning. Teaching, as we all know, and this is something we've said for many years now. I remember when I was a student at the university, we were quite upset with this. Teaching has usually been a quite adult-centered activity. This has to change. Education is not or should not be about control. It's about learning, and we must not confuse authority with authoritarianism. That happens very much in schools. For this, of course, teachers must be well selected, well formed, well trained. They must be equipped with the proper competencies. They have to be motivated, respected, granted relative autonomy in their quest for excellence in teaching. And of course, and this is something that is easily said, but it's very difficult to achieve, teachers have to be remunerated according to the relevance and the responsibility of their work. In many countries, they are not. Teachers should be also equipped with adequate teaching resources. And talking about teaching resources, this is something that sometimes strikes me as crazy. We're living through a digital revolution. Digital teaching and learning resources could become one of the most powerful tools for transforming the way in which teachers teach and learners learn, as well as for democratizing education through expanded access. However, if not harnessed properly, the digital revolution could rather become a dangerous force for furthering educational inequality. With the pandemic, we saw both the promise and the peril of digital resources. Amid the emergency, digital technology allowed many schools and teachers around the world to reach their students, to support their learning through the pandemic. However, especially in low and middle income countries, many, and when I say many, I say really many teachers and students did not have access either to necessary equipment or to reliable connectivity. So it became rather a factor for increasing inequality. But access to broadband connectivity and to the necessary gadgets is only half the story. The other half has to do with the educational content and the teaching and the learning resources that could be available through digital media. And here what we are trying to achieve at the summit is that we should understand that these learning resources or teaching resources should be seen as typical public goods. And I say this in the language of economics because these resources, they do require a significant effort and a very high fixed cost to be produced. They require money and work for being produced. But once they are produced, they could be widely used by an increasing amount of teachers and students everywhere with very little or no additional cost. But if you leave this to the market, such resources would become artificially scarce and quite expensive, which is what happens when they are private commodities. That is why at the summit, and this is something that the Secretary General has insisted on, we must effectively transform digital learning and teaching resources into global public goods so that their financing, their design, their production, but especially their distribution is organized so as to guarantee free and open access for teachers and learners all over the world. And finally, of course, all these things I'm mentioning, they don't come cheap. They cost money. So we're also proposing what should be obvious, to invest what it takes to have quality education for all, and to make sure that those resources are allocated equitably and used efficiently. What I'm saying is we need to invest more in education, but we also need to invest more equitably and more efficiently. The problem is that we have said this many times, but we have not delivered. And when this kind of thing happens, you have to ask yourselves, why didn't we? Today, educational opportunities and educational investment remain incredibly unequal, both between and within countries. And there are different statistics, but for example, according to a recent data from the Global Education Monitoring Report, and these numbers are really amazing, rich countries invest an average of $8,500 per year per school-age person. $8,000 and $8,500. Upper middle income countries invest about 1,000. That's 8 times less. And you're talking about upper middle income. When you talk about lower middle income countries, what they invest is $275 per school-age person. Just $275 a year. And for the poorest countries, it's almost unbelievable. They invest less than $50 per year per school-age person. So the distance is between $8,000 and $50 per school year per person. The distance, the inequality in the world is really staggering. And within countries, we also know that from birth, the educational opportunities of children of higher income and better educated families are dramatically better than those available to the children of lower income and not so well-educated families, as are their learning resources, their learning outcomes. Thus, education has been, instead of reducing inequality, education has been increasing inequality.
At the Z1
financing of public education from a seemingly unsolvable expenditure problem into what should be the most efficient and socially responsible investment we can make. Of course, there is increasing research, and even the World Bank has a lot of research about this, which demonstrate the potential economic advantages of increasing educational investment. The rationale is very clear. No other investment has a higher private rate of return than education, especially early child education. Returns are even higher when you consider not just the private returns, which means $1 in education, how much does it increase a future income for the person that gets that education? But when we include external returns produced by each person's education in the income of and the welfare of the rest of society, then the returns of education are even higher. And then, as I mentioned above, we have all those benefits of from education, which, while they do not translate into simple economic returns, are essential for our individual and collective capacity for leading a good life together. So there shouldn't be a doubt on whether investing in education makes sense. So if we know, and we've known this for years, that investing in education is not only ethically imperative, but that it also pays more than any other investment, then the question is, why don't we just do it? And I think that to understand why, the answer again has to do with the different contexts in which educational investment occur. There is a very strong relation between the kind of development a country has and the kind of education it gets. And the relation goes both ways, from development to education and from education to development. If I put it in very simple terms, almost a caricature, but an accurate caricature, When you have a country that is itself highly unequal, which has a large supply of very cheap labor, it can find itself into what we call low-level equilibrium, or most commonly into a poverty trap. What does this mean? The type of investments mostly attracted by the abundance of cheap labor are typically unsophisticated investments with low capital intensity, low productivity, and little need for that thing that some like to call human capital, knowledge, education. But still, these investments can be very profitable. With no need for increasing a qualified labor force, there is very little incentive in such an economy for raising taxes in order to finance education, which is perceived as a mere expenditure. The situation can be even more complicated when countries get entangled into the typical race to the bottom, where they deregulate the labor market to compete with other countries, they increase the exploitation of natural resources to compete with other countries, they grant generous tax exemptions to further reduce costs and compete with other countries. So we compete against one country against the other, and we reduce our ability to finance social development and education. Many authors, and I will just quote Acemoglu and Robinson, but many others before them have argued that in countries where these extractive or low productivity economies prevail, the institutional framework tends to be weak, and the balance of economic and political power is significantly skewed towards the upper echelons of income and wealth, which again tends to oppose the kind of progressive tax increases that would be necessary to finance universal quality education. This is a typical vicious cycle that we have to break if we want to finance education and to have a really sustainable development. We frequently hear that education could play a key role in promoting economic growth, in improving social living conditions, and achieving truly sustainable development. But the question is, could education deliver us from those poverty traps, from those low-level equilibrium? And I think the truth is that poverty traps and races to the bottom strategies are precisely the opposite of sustainable development. They are inequitable, they are environmentally destructive, they are economically inefficient, and they tend toward anti-democratic concentration of power. But they can be quite profitable, both for the local and for the global elites. They constitute a perverse equilibrium, and they are, in fact, the main obstacle for transformation of education into a true human right. This is an obstacle that we must overcome in order to achieve the kind of education required for a dynamic, equitable, and sustainable development. And reaching this point, there is something that we should remember, because sometimes we try to say, okay, but education is a human right and human rights should be financed and respected. But we also should remember that when you look at it historically, no human right has ever been graciously conceded. They all had to be fought for. Education will not be different. Those who are being excluded from education, excluded from learning, will have to fight for the right, which also means to fight to escape from poverty traps. I said at the beginning that this is not a technical but a political summit. Thus, if this summit is to achieve its goal, it will have to ignite a movement for the transformation of education, which will have to be also a movement for equitable, sustainable development, a movement against poverty trap, against inequality. Only then will we transform quality education into a true and effective human right. In this movement, the role of youth is of the essence. You must be central actors in the movement for the transformation of education, which is at the same time the movement for transforming our own and your own lives. That's the challenge we have at the summit, which again, as I said, it shouldn't be seen as an end in itself, but rather as an igniting moment for this kind of movement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for so brilliantly setting the tone for our consultation and the discussions today, addressing many of the crucial issues learners are confronted with, and the political, social, as well as very much the economical realities behind them. We appreciate your very busy schedule and that you found the time to join us today. Thanks for that. And we wish you and the whole TESS organizing team, Summit Secretariat, everyone involved, all the best for the work ahead in this intensive last weeks before the summit, and look forward to the event in New York, as well as the work that lies ahead of all of us in contributing to making the commitments a reality beyond the summit. So thank you very much for this intervention. And colleagues, now the ball is in your court. We will proceed with a short presentation on the action tracks 1 and 2 before moving into the breakout rooms. We will have 4 breakout rooms, one for Africa and North America, Africa, sorry, Europe and North America, number 2. The third one is for Latin America, where we'll also have Portuguese and Spanish speakers in the session. So the working language of that session will be Portuguese and Spanish. And fourth, the breakout room number 4 will be Middle East, Asia, and colleagues from the Pacific calling in. Each breakout session will take 15 minutes. After the first breakout session, we will have a 10 minutes break. And before moving to the next breakouts, dealing with action track 3 and 4, and last but not least, action track 5 in the end. The guiding questions that will be directed towards you will be posted in the breakout room chats by our facilitators, and we will very much minute all the inputs and recommendations that you put forward in order to then synthesize that into an outcome document in the coming days that will be looped back to all of your unions for the regional platforms, 2 days to add additional comments. Now, enough in regards to practicalities. I would say let's proceed, and I'm happy to hand the floor to Jacob and Bianca to present action track 1 and 2 before we move to the breakout sessions. Bianca and Jacob, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm speaking from Brazil. And to talk about inclusive, equitable, safe, and healthy school, which is our track number 1, it is necessary to consider that the high rates of poverty, exclusion, insecurity, and gender inequality still hold millions back from learning. The COVID, the violence, armed conflicts, refuge and internal displacement, natural hazard, including climate-conducted disasters and associated economic migration, and a growing backlash against gender equality and women's rights are widening inequalities. The health and well-being of learners is a critical point. Increasing numbers of them are vulnerable to poverty, malnutrition, infectious disease, early and unintended pregnancy, and poor psychosocial and mental health. Marginalized groups are suffering the most in the whole world. So we need a vision for education, schools, and their surrounding education communities that must be transformed to become more responsive to the needs of learners and to ensure that their rights are met. Bold action is needed if the international community is to meet the commitments and make education inclusive for all. So we are going to have the breakout rooms to discuss what policies could contribute to change this reality and to effectively make education inclusive in the different parts of the world.
And then I will take over for track number 2. And for track number 2, it's about learning and skills for life, work, and sustainable development. And it's about transforming education. It means empowering learners with knowledge and skills and values and attitudes to be resilient, adaptable, and prepared for an uncertain future. And to do so, we must emphasize on basic literacy and numeracy and education for sustainable development, meaning educational and climate education and skills for employment. So it's about lifelong learning. It's about how when we start early, it's about the foundational skills, and it's about skills for the future, and it's about skills that can activate people and individuals and as agents of change in the transition towards a digital and a green economy. And so about also this the whole student and whole child approach, but also the whole society approach and how they are interconnected. And this is what we'll talk about in track 2.
So colleagues, while I am opening up the breakout rooms, you can have a look on the guiding questions for action track 1 and action track 2. I'm going to open up 4 breakout rooms according to the regions, and I'm going to allow you to assign yourselves manually to whatever breakout room you want to be a part of. And I forgot to say before, the African breakout room will also have French language support. So give me 1 minute and we're gonna start with the breakout room sessions. Colleagues that are facilitating, you are all co-hosts in case you want to screen share the presentation. Otherwise, you can also just post the questions into the chat. Colleagues, welcome back from the break. We're gonna move to the next presentation of action track 3 and 4. And it's my pleasure to give the floor to Ellen and Shireen to present these tracks. Here we go. Number 3.
Hello to the students of the world. We are now moving on to thematic action track 3, which is teachers, teaching and the teaching profession, which is co-led by Nigeria, Romania, and the International Task Force for Education 2030. Accelerating progress towards SDG 4 requires that there is an adequate number of teachers to meet learners' needs, and all education personnel are trained, motivated, and supported. There are 80 million teachers worldwide. That's quite a few. They are essential to ensure that students feel supported, considered, and aided in their educational journey and their belonging in the world. In 2016, though, 69 million teachers were estimated to be necessary to achieve SDG 4 quality education by 2030. The point of this particular track is to create an education workforce that is sustainable and achievable. This is because education systems are suffering from 4 major challenges: personnel shortages, difficulties in acquiring adequate qualifications, skills, and professional development needs of teaching personnel, low status and working conditions, and lack of opportunities to develop teacher leadership, autonomy, and innovation. There are 4 main aims for this particular track. The first one is each country has the right number of well-trained and qualified teachers and other educational professionals in the right place with the right skills. The next is that all teachers have quality training and continuous professional development. The next is every teacher, school leader, and education worker has a recognized professional status, can participate in social and policy dialogues and conditions that enable them to be effective. And teachers and other professional roles should be empowered to lead learning, innovation, and harness relevant research. There are 10 strategies for this track to achieve this. The first is develop comprehensive national policies for teachers and teaching personnel. The next is develop standards and competency frameworks for teachers, including integration of ICT into teacher education and practice. To design certification mechanisms and continuous upgrading programs of in-service teaching personnel. To promote wider education workforce team-based approaches to support teaching and learning, to empower leadership, motivation, and innovation, to promote robust social dialogue and teacher participation in educational decision-making, to prioritize integrated national reform strategies and effective functional governance, to support inclusion of refugees and other teachers in crisis and emergency settings in national teacher management and development systems, to honour commitments made to the call to education on education finance, the call to action on education finance 2021, and to offer additional support for teachers in TVET and LLL. Now that sounds like a lot of things, but we will break it down a little bit further. But first I'm going to turn over to my colleague Shireen to give you a breakdown for track 4. Thanks everyone.
Thank you so much, Ellen. So track 4 is on digital learning and transformation. Digital transformation requires harnessing technology as part of a larger systematic effort, with investment and action in digital learning should be guided by centering the marginalized, free, high quality education content, and pedagogical innovation and change. So some of the things that have been mentioned in this particular track is digital transformation of education systems, connectivity or narrowing digital divide, free, open, high quality digital education content, digital citizenship, well-being and privacy. We all saw what happened during the COVID-19 when all schools worldwide were closed down, and the kind of challenges that students had to face when the schools were closed down, and including teachers as well. So there needs to be involvement, and states or governments need to invest their finances into digital learning and, you know, digital privacy when it comes to anything that surrounds students. We also feel that as students, we need to be given free data. There's a document we've been working on as Global Students Forum, and this is a document that we shared with the world during the World Higher Education Conference that happened in Spain. We shared it with different UNESCO heads and tried to put that out, what students had asked different governments to put in place. And some of the things that were mentioned were, you know, we need to have digital learning tools and mobile internet devices that should be free and provided to students to enable the development of technological skills and knowledge necessary to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic, both in the immediate coping phase and in the period of economic recovery. We know what each and every student, and especially those from Africa, are going through, that you need to pay school fees and still you need to buy internet to access the information that is being given. So there's need for financing to come to this specific issue. Then we also have we are requesting governments and states and different stakeholders that are involved to ensure that there is the existing digital learning environments and online training systems that need to be redesigned and improved to cover more advanced technology, contributing to skill learning and professional development of digital uses. When we talk about skill learning, we're talking about involving and ensuring that every student is captured, you know, when digital transformation is involved. We need to protect the data of students. Students' data needs to be protected and banned from being commercially used by higher education institutions and educational authority, because privacy should be one of our priorities even as we grow up and become better citizens. So one of the things that stands out for me is that we need to have, you know, flipped classroom styles, approaches. Appropriate funding should be pumped into this for digital learning tools, have public and democratic governance, open platforms, and control of the presence of private providers should be prioritized. So if we have, you know, Zoom giving us the opportunity to have our classes online, then there should be something that consider that these are students and separates us from, you know, people that are already working. So I will give this back to Ellen to continue from where we picked on. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Ellen and Shireen. I'm going to open the breakout rooms once again. We're going to have 15 minutes for action track 3 and action track 4. Then we're going to come back one last time for action track 5. Thanks for everyone who is sticking around. Your inputs are really important for the outcome document of this consultation, also in action track 5. So without further ado, I'm opening the rooms, and good luck for action track 3 and 4. You can assign yourself right now.
All right, so finally, we are going to have the last session. They're very good ride so far. The last track is going to look at financing of education, and the implementation of the right to education requires funding in order to build schools, pay teachers' salaries, and provide for their training, provide for teaching materials and all that. Under international law, we know states have to use the maximum of their available resources to realize the right of education. Even when a state resources are very limited, it is an obligation for the state to prioritize certain immediate obligations, such as introduction of free primary education and all that. It is also an obligation to provide progressively free secondary and higher education, and perhaps also provide for higher education, and also to continuously improve the quality of education. This means that it must take immediate and progressive steps to fully realize the right to education, and must not take retrogressive measures. We are going to ask the essential question: how much do governments spend on education? Who pays for the education? How are their resources being spent? These seemingly simple questions are very difficult to answer for many countries that lack sustainable systems to collect, disseminate, and even analyze the data on education financing. How can your nation especially promote inclusiveness in policies, their legislation, planning, and their budgeting? So we are going to address these gaps in education financing if you address these gaps in education financing, we will be achieving the SDG 4, especially in 3 key areas. One will be mobilizing more resources, especially domestic resources, to provide for quality of education. The second will be increasing the efficiency and the equity of allocations and expenditure, and improving education financing data. The third will be providing for adequate and sustainable funding, which is matched to the country's needs and equity and efficiency of spending on that education. So this last track on education finance is going to delve into that spaces. I'll allow us go into our rooms where our moderators will introduce us to the 3 key questions that we are going to provide answers to. Thank you very much. See you soon.
Thanks so much, Bismarck. People, one last time, I'm going to open the rooms and we see each other in 15 minutes. Good luck for this last breakout session.